Is the West fighting and preparing for the wrong war, for the wrong kind of war? And is Russia about to launch a major offensive of their own? I think the evidence shows that both answers are yes. The West is locked in the wrong kind of focus. We've been thinking that here's the way war works, and by extension, that's how it works for everybody all the time. And we have been blind to what could be unfolding right before our eyes. And I don't have any secret information. I don't know for sure that Russia's about to do this, but what I'm going to show you is there is a lot of physical evidence that something big, something we have not seen during this war, could be coming, and we are absolutely not prepared for it. And there's nobody better I can think of to examine this than the friend of the show, Colonel Jacques Baud, former Swiss strategic intelligence officer, former NATO officer, and has proven himself to just be spot on about understanding a lot of these things. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be back with you. Thank you.
Well, like I was telling you before we went on the air here, I've been looking forward to this show for a long time because I read a piece, an article in the Royal United Services Institute on what an attritional warfare model is. And then it looks at the Russia-Ukraine war and makes a number of cases in there about what is actually happening on the ground. And when I read that the first time in detail, especially, it just leapt out at me that it seems like the best description of what we physically see and have seen for the last 2.5 years, and then lays a path of what could be coming next. And this is why I say I don't have any secret intelligence that knows what the Russian side is going to do, but I can say that the pieces of the evidence we can see on the ground lead to the conclusion that something really unpleasant for the Western side, and especially the Ukraine, could be coming. So I'm really grateful to have you unpack a lot of this.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question. The problem is that in the West, we didn't want to understand exactly what the Russians wanted to achieve in Ukraine. I mean, the allegation that Russia wanted to take over Ukraine or topple the government and all that. Uh, the Russians had never said so, and they never demonstrated in any way that he wanted to take over Ukraine. And I would even say that they said almost the contrary, because they know that if it would be rather, I say rather easy to take over the eastern and southern part of Ukraine, it would be quite difficult to take over the western part of Ukraine, which is highly ultra nationalistic, extremely anti Russian. At least it has turned so during the war. So the Russians don't want to engage, if not forced to. They will certainly not want to engage on the western side of the Dnieper River. So we have to come back to what the Russians have said since the very beginning of their offensive. And remember that these objectives have been stated by Vladimir Putin on the 24th of February 2022. And since then, they never changed the substance of these objectives. I mean, the nature of this objective.
Mhm.
The extent of this objective have changed. I will explain why,
Yep.
but the nature of the objective have not changed. And these objectives were namely the two, but this was one objective divided in two, if you want. It was to demilitarize and to denazify the threat to the population of Donbass. This is the key point. That means that in strategic terms, if we look at it from a Clausewitzian uh, perspective, if you want, it's about destroying a potential and not to take over territory. And that explains a little bit. If you want, I can show here the map of the idea of this the initial operation, and you had in the in the this in the Donbass area, where you have, in fact, the main thrust. That means where you will put more resources. The objective is the strategic objective, namely to demilitarize and denazify the threat to the Donbass. And then you have, and that's absolutely consistent with the Russian doctrine, you have a second thrust that is supposed to facilitate the achievement of the main thrust. And this second thrust is the thrust that we have observed in the first phase of the conflict in the north towards Kiev. And here with two objectives, namely to pin down the Ukraine forces and to exert a political pressure on the authorities in Kiev.
And you know,
And if
that's almost the opposite, not almost. That is the opposite of what you hear Western leaders, especially President Biden, who said in just recent days that the objective of the Russians was to capture Kiev in 5 days. So he said, and because they
no,
failed to do that, et cetera. But you're saying that was not even. Not only did they not want to capture it in 5 days, it was a secondary objective for the primary objective.
exactly. And in fact, if you the Russians never said that. First of all, they never set a timeline for the operation. So they never said they would take Kiev or Ukraine in 1 day, 3 days, 1 week, or 2 weeks. They never said so. These were Western allegation. They mainly come from the Institute of Studies of War, but the Russians themselves have never put any timeline on their operation. And if you look the way this was executed, I mean, the first phase, you could see, if you look at the number of battalion or battalion tactical group that were engaged in that operation, you would see that the main resources were, as a matter of fact, in the Donbass. This is still, as of today, this is still where the main operations are going on, where you have the most violent fightings. This is today. It is in that area here. So it's still in the Donbass area. While here around Kiev, it was only 1/3 of the potential that was engaged in the Donbass. You had only 22 battalion tactical groups, meaning that the Russians had never the potential and the capabilities to take over Kiev. In my book on the Russian art of war, I made some calculation, and basically, if in open terrain, normally, I mean, the rule of the thumb is that to attack, you should have a ratio of 3-1. But when it comes to urban warfare, and if you take the calculation, I mean, empirical calculation that have been done by Colonel Dupuy in the 80s. He made several books. It's a U.S. Army colonel, by the way. He made very interesting book on the quantification of war, and he made some calculation. And the Russians have also made some calculation, meaning that for urban warfare, in order to have success, you should have a ratio of 10-1. And in Kiev, in the early stage of the war, you had 60,000 um, defender or Ukrainian forces, meaning that with the 22,000 soldiers, the Russians would never been able. They had only 1/3 of the capabilities of the Ukrainians. So it was absolutely never a question to take over Kiev.
You know, I
But
think that this map right here, this graphic that you're showing, is the most comprehensive proof that Russia never intended to physically capture Kiev, only put political pressure on it. Because, as I mean, it's self-evident there. When you put that much of your combat power in the main effort in the east, that's where it was from the beginning. And I think that should put completely to rest any thought that Russia tried to capture Kiev in the beginning.
And the idea here around Kiev was to prevent reinforcements that would then come to reinforce the force. These were the bulk of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. Remember that the Ukrainian forces started their build up in the Donbass area as early as April 2021.
Mm,
And that because there was this decree of Volodymyr Zelensky to retake the southern part of the country, that means Crimea and the area of Donbass. And that for that reason, you had so many troops deployed 1 year before the start of the Russian offensive. You had so many troops here. But since the forces in Russia were so strong, they might have, I mean, the Ukrainians might have been able to reinforce those troops through what they had in the west of the country. And for that reason, the Russians surrounded Kiev so that the reserves here were then pinned down and could not go to the Donbass because of the threat on Kiev. That's the calculation of the Russians.
right.
Now,
So now I think it's really important at this point, especially before we get into what may be happening now, is to look at. I think that the graphic nature of the misunderstanding of what this war is all about and where it's going here on the American side, first of all. So obviously, we just finished with the NATO summit, the 75th anniversary, where everybody just continued to promise indefinite support for Ukraine. They'll there's an inevitable they'll be joining someday. This bridge to the future, all this kind of stuff, implying that yeah, we're kind of in a static war here, and we can just go on indefinitely with doing that. That was reinforced I think just yesterday, actually, with the new vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, when he was interviewed and asked his thoughts on the war. Notice what he says here. It's very important.
The reality is the Ukrainians have showed that Putin is a lot weaker than people feared. And importantly, they've shown that if the Europeans are willing to step up and take more responsibility for their own defense, they can handle Putin. Let us focus on China.
And so you see there, and he says that they're a lot weaker than we think. So the fact that Russia has only taken 22% or 20% of Ukraine from the beginning, that means that's all they can take. So they can't do anything more. And they've been trying. They would love to do it more, but they can't. So we don't have to worry about that. So we can just get it over with. But as we're going to talk about here in a minute, and I'm going to start putting up some other stuff on the screen here, I think that there is a massive misunderstanding of what Russia actually is doing.
I think here what we have to take into account, remember that this first phase of the Russian operation was between end of February and end of March. Now, what happened end of March? Remember, this was the discussion and the negotiation in Istanbul, and this negotiation was about to succeed with the idea that Ukraine would remain neutral and that the Russians would withdraw from Ukraine. So that means that the Russians were ready to remove their troops from Ukraine, and that's an additional demonstration or proof or evidence that the Russians never wanted to take over the
Yeah.
territory. They wanted to destroy a potential. And that's the reason why they were ready to give back all this terrain as soon as April 2022. But this was prevented by the West. And the West started then to support massively Ukraine. I remind you that on in May June 2022, Zelensky said that he was depending on the West for his equipment because the Ukrainian army has been destroyed. So again, this objective of demilitarizing was in fact achieved at the beginning of in March, April 2022. So what happened next? Because the West started to help massively and support massively Ukraine, the Russians understood that the objective of the Western countries were not to help Ukraine, but in fact to engage into some kind of attrition warfare against Russia. And that's the reason why you may remember that in October 2022, I mean, on the 18th of October 2022, General Surovikin, the head of the forces in Ukraine, said, "We have now a different strategy. We do not strive for high tempo of advance. We try to preserve each and every soldier, and methodically we are grinding the advancing enemy." That means that from that point, they decided that they had reached the demilitarization, but now they have to demilitarize the new, if I can put it that way, the new Ukrainian army. That means this
Right.
army that was armed by the West.
Yeah, and
And
I
for
think that's
that,
again one of the most lack of understanding. I remember when he made those statements there, and I also remember some of the response in the West was, "Oh, he's just saying that to try to put a good face on what they're doing. They're not trying to protect anybody, and they're so weak they can't do anything else." But I think that there was oblivious to what was actually going on behind the scenes, and that's why I want to get into this RUSI article by Alex Vershinin, because that's going to start to peel back the curtain a little bit more on what's going on. Now, I do want to show, even before I get into that, a couple of other things to really set the stage for why this is so important that our readers understand, that the Western leaders understand, frankly. And there's at least one person in the West that does understand this and seems to understand it a lot more than anyone else, and that's Viktor Orban. Here's what he said to Bild magazine in an interview just a couple of weeks back.
The presidency of the European Union, I mean the European Council, simply cannot afford not to deal with how to get closer to peace, and whether is there any chance to close the war, ceasefire or peace talk. So if any rotating European presidency of the Council would not deal with that, that would be hypocrisy. So I have a strong moral and political motivation that we have to do something. And my estimation is that in the forthcoming 2-3 months, till the American election, what will happen on the front line? It will far worse than it was up to now.
Why do you think so?
More weapons are there, and the Russians are moving consistently ahead. So the energy of the confrontation, the number of deaths, the lost lives, the casualties will be more brutal than it was in the last 7 months.
Now, if Russia was just stuck where they are, they were in a stalemate, they couldn't go any further, there would be no impetus to do that. But Orban is showing that there is emphatic near-term pressure he feels to bring this to a conclusion fast. And he says that the consequences of war are about to go up, that something is coming, that he says, and this came right after he went and visited with President Putin himself, after he'd also visited with Zelensky. And in case anybody's wondering what Putin had said on the matter and what may have been said behind closed doors, check this out.
They probably hope that at some point we will get scared. But at the same time, they talk about wanting to achieve a strategic defeat of Russia on the battlefield. What does this mean for Russia? For Russia, it means the end of its statehood. It means the end of the 1,000-year history of the Russian state. I think this is clear to everyone. So the question arises, why should we be afraid? Isn't it better to go all the way then? This is basic formal logic. I think those who think this way, and even more so those who say this, are making another big mistake.
So you see there, he is absolutely focused on it's existential for us. There's no going back. There's no half measures. There's, in my view, zero possibility that Putin could ever go, you know what, we're tired of war. Sure, we'll just have a negotiated settlement and just quit fighting right here. without having achieved his original objectives of turning Ukraine into a safe zone for him, whether it's denazify or just make it a neutral state, which is also one of the things he wanted to. But I just wonder, before I get into this article here, what do you think about the legitimacy or the sincerity of Putin there?
I think Putin is consistent since 2014. And he always, I mean, the whole effort he put into the compliance of the Minsk agreement and the efforts he put diplomatically to have Germany and France making pressure on Ukraine to sign the Minsk agreement shows that the main effort of Vladimir Putin was in fact the protection of the population of Donbass, and this was absolutely consistent. That's what he said, that's what he did, and that where the and we have the proof, by the way, that the West failed in that. I mean, it failed in many ways. First of all, Germany and France were the guarantors for the Ukrainian implementation of the Minsk agreement. And both François Hollande, President of France, and Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, both of them, and I don't even mention Petro Poroshenko and Volodymyr Zelensky, who all of them, all the four of them, said that they had never the intention to implement the Minsk agreement, meaning that there is obviously on the Western side a bad faith on that. But there's an additional point of that, because remember that the Minsk agreement, and namely the second agreement, there were two agreements, one in September 2014, and a second agreement in February 2015. And the second agreement became a resolution of the Security Council, meaning that in principle, all the members of the Security Council should have supported the implementation of that resolution. And in that respect, we have to acknowledge that only Russia and China tried to have this resolution implemented. The three others Western countries, France, both as guarantor and as a permanent member of the Security Council, refused to do so. US was not bound in the Minsk agreement, but as member of the permanent member of the Security Council, didn't comply with the resolution they decided, and the same for Great Britain. So we see that if we look at the facts, we have to be honest and consider that Vladimir Putin never changed his posture regarding the population of Donbass. And there is also something I didn't mention here. I mentioned the decree of Volodymyr Zelensky on March 2021 to initiate an operation against Donbass. But there's another law that has been passed by the Ukrainian parliament on the 1st of July 2021 that makes official discrimination between the Ukrainians, I mean, ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And that adds to the equation. And on the 12th of July 2021, Vladimir Putin wrote a very long article to in fact discuss this law that had been adopted by the Ukrainian parliament, meaning that Putin has been absolutely consistent in his intent to support the Donbass. And that's exactly what we are seeing today. The problem is that because the West is constantly supporting, providing weapons to Ukraine, and in fact, making Ukraine some kind of artificial life, if you want.
Yeah.
The only consequence of that is that the attrition war that was initiated by General Surovikin in October 22, in fact, will be prolonged. I mean, in fact, has been prolonged, and one of the most uh, uh, um, evident feature of that strategy was the Battle of Bakhmut, where you had so many Ukrainians who, in fact, died on the battlefield for nothing.
Yeah.
But other battles like Avdiivka
Yeah.
and others are probably in the same range of casualties.
Right.
But, sorry.
And really, and
Yeah.
on that, I want to shift over to something here, because all these things you're talking about here are grave mistakes and understanding of what Russia was doing and how the war is going on, how it can even move to any kind of terminus, especially the United States. We've been at the forefront of this era here, but there's a second era that I now want to shift our attention to, and that is to understanding what Russia's doing. You just alluded to part of it when Surovikin actually said, here's what we're doing. Here's the strategy that we've now adopted. This article in the Royal United Services Institute explains what that means and puts us in a pretty dark position of the fact that the longer we go to not understanding the things that were in this, the worse it's going to be for us. And Alex Verschinen was great. I wish we could have had him on the show, but he's not able to come on just due to his position here. But his words live on, and they're now out there. And I'd like you to talk about some. So first of all, I want to look at what he wrote about what an attrition war even is, because in this he talks about how the West views things, and then this is how other people view things. He wrote, attritional warfare requires an art of war and are fought with a force-centric approach, unlike the wars of maneuver, which are terrain-focused. They are rooted in massive industrial capacity to enable the replacement of losses, geographical depth to absorb a series of defeats, and technological conditions that prevent rapid ground movement. In attritional wars, military operations are shaped by a state's ability to replace losses and generate new formations, not tactical and operational maneuvers. The side that accepts the attritional nature of war and focuses on destroying enemy forces rather than gaining terrain is most likely to win. I wonder if you can talk about that, because the Western way of war, really going all the way back to World War II, is these what's called big arrow movements, large formations, movement of large areas. And that was in the Desert Storm we saw. I participated in that one. It was this huge arrow of the U.S. 7th Corps that ended up hitting the Saddam Hussein's forces in the flank up in Kuwait. You certainly had that on display in 2003 when the United States ended up taking Baghdad, etc. So that's kind of how we think of things. Therefore, since we've seen this war basically be static since June or July of 2022 along the current line of contact, the thought is that that's because they can't do a big one, so they're not going to. But I wonder if you can talk about the difference between that mentality and attritional war mentality.
In fact, the war from a Clausewitzian perspective, and remember that the Russians or the Russian military doctrine is based basically on Clausewitz thinking. And the Clausewitz thinking basically is force-centric. That means that the main purpose of war is to destroy the military potential of the enemy. The problem is that there are two ways of doing that. The first way is to go and hunt for the enemy and go and try to move aggressively towards the enemy, which is quite risky, and you may lose a lot of troops in that. Or the second aspect is that you put on a defensive line and you let the enemy come and you destroy the enemy as it comes. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, I'm not sure that the Russians were ready or were planning, better said, to have an attrition war. Because remember that after the first phase of their operation, in fact, Ukraine was ready to sign up some kind of an agreement. And therefore, basically, Russia had already won, if we can use that word, won the war, or achieved their objective, better said, in March, April 2022. So there was no plan to go in an attrition. But as soon as they observed that the West was wanting to have this kind of attrition and try to defeat Russia, because the end objective for the West, and this has been said many times. It's less to help Ukraine than to have a regime
Yep.
change in Russia.
Russia.
And to have this regime change, they wanted to have all the sanctions that would weaken the economy and weaken the society. And with a weakened society, then you would provoke kind of a revolution or some changes in the political system that would then allow for a change of Vladimir Putin to somebody else. I don't know whom, and nobody knows whom, by the way. So that
Right.
was
Nobody.
the idea. But the point is that the Russians have understood that very quickly, and they built up their defense and started an attrition war. And that's exactly what Surovikin explained. And based on that attrition, the idea is to destroy the potential. And that's exactly what they are doing now. And we see that the Ukrainian army is severely weakened. And the same as the equipment, which is also that's the reason why the F-16 seems so vital for Zelensky and other pieces of equipment, even Bofors gun of the Second World War that Denmark just decided to deliver. These are the anti-aircraft gun from the Second World War. From the Second World War. So, meaning that we see that the West is definitely unable to sustain the war effort that is required by or asked for by Ukraine.
Yeah, and in
Meaning
fact,
that
that's a good place to pivot. So I want to show the next section of this because it gets right to what you're saying here. It shows what is necessary to win an attritional kind of war. Gary, if you can bring that second one up there. Wars of attrition are won by economies, enabling mass mobilization of militaries via their industrial sectors. Armies expand rapidly during such a conflict, requiring mass quantities of armored vehicles, drones, electronic products, and other combat equipment. Because high-end weaponry is very complex to manufacture and it consumes vast resources, a high-low mixture of forces and weapons is imperative to win. But the West, we don't have that. So we don't have the industrial capacity that can handle a mass expansion. Ukraine definitely doesn't, but we can't do low-end stuff. All we know how to make is these high-end stuff that's a really high dollar figure, and they have low production quality. But it seems Russia, and tell me if I'm wrong here, Russia has taken the opposite approach where they do have a mix.
First of all, we have to understand that Russia, as opposed to Western countries, resisted the temptation to privatize their military industrial complex. They have kind of mixed type of industries involved in the armament production, which is something that most European countries had before the end or during the Cold War, let's say. And the advantage of such a situation is that the companies and factories that produce weapons are not bound to profit, but are bound to national interest. If you want today to ask a company, a US company or a French company, to expand its production of artillery gun or ammunition and so on and so forth, they will have to make some investments to enlarge the production lines and all that. But no company will do that without knowing for how long they are engaging these investments. And therefore, they will be reluctant to spend a lot of money to create new production lines or to create new products, because that requires from their side a huge investment. And that's not the case in Russia, because the companies which are not privatized, which are state owned, of course, they focus on the national interest. I mean, they receive an order from the government and they just execute the order. It's not a matter of how what kind of return on investment you will have and all that.
Right.
You see, and that's where we in the West we are a little bit prisoner of this kind of privatization of the military-industrial complex. In essence, it's not a bad thing, but in times of crisis, then of course other rules apply. It's not the money you make, but how you can fulfill the objectives of the government, and that's why the Russians are much more powerful than the West.
Well, and
That's
I think, Colonel, that illustrates a couple of things. Is that one, as that clip we played of Putin in Vietnam above or earlier in this show talks about, to them, this is an existential fight. I mean, they not only are against Ukraine, but as we keep saying all the time, it's 50 nations allied against them. So whether NATO troops are in the ground, certainly NATO military capacity and training and electronic warfare and all kinds of other things are involved. So Russia's pulling out all the stops. On the other hand, we're not directly engaged in this war. And so far, none of our troops we are not at war, which has a direct impact on the economies of war. Gary, if you can put that next one up there here, because this is the next thing he talks about in the RUSI article. It says achieving mass is difficult for higher end Western economies. To achieve hyper efficiency, they have to shed excess capacity and struggle to rapidly expand, especially since lower tier industries have been transferred abroad for economic reasons. During war, global supply chains are disrupted and subcomponents can no longer be secured. Added to this conundrum is the lack of skilled workforce with experience in a particular industry. These skills are acquired over decades, and once an industry is shuttered, it takes decades to rebuild. So because we're not in an existential war, our economies have not been kicked over to wartime. And so we're just inching along at trying to increase like 155 millimeter shells, for example. And I wonder if you can just talk about the difference in war-making approach from what Russia's doing right now, especially industrial, and what the West cumulatively is doing with war potential.
Oh, the West, first of all, has, during the last 30 years, the West has waged totally different wars as the one which is going on in Ukraine. Basically, what you have now in Ukraine are two peer armies fighting each other. Basically, I mean, the Russians are a little bit more powerful, but in essence, this is the same kind of army, the same kind of weaponry, the same kind of they may have different tactics and different operational ideas, but in essence, we are talking about two similar army fighting each other, which is for the West totally new, because in the last 30 years, the Western armies have fought against insurgencies, against enemies that had not the same capabilities. I mean, no air force, just an example. So they never had to deal with an air threat. Basically, the same with electronic warfare. Equally, I mean, if you see, for instance, recently there was an article. I mean, several articles that have shown, and I can show here just a summary of these fail. Oh, sorry, this is not this one. Sorry about that. This one, you had several. Sorry, I have to check. Here we go. You see, these kind of weapons, which are in essence excellent and technologically very sophisticated, but they were never used against or in an environment which is electronically warfare rich. And that the same applies to others. I mean, the same to the small diameter bomb. This is exactly the same thing. They are useless because of the Russian jamming. The same with the JDAM weapon. It's ineffective just because of electronic warfare. And you have the HIMARS, which has exactly the same problem. So meaning that basically you have armies and weapons that are provided to Ukraine that were certainly good, but they are not designed for operating in this environment. And on the Russian side, on the other, we see, on the contrary, they are extremely quick in developing countermeasures. For instance, in those articles that I have mentioned here about these this ammunition, within weeks, the Russians were able to set up experts team and so on, engineers to reverse engineer the Western technologies and to find countermeasures. As a result, today they are no longer effective. This is a kind of situation that the West has never encountered in the last 30 years. So we are in such a situation, and that's the ability of the Russians to respond very quickly to new emerging technological threats. I mean, remember at the very beginning of the military operation, you had, the West, in the Western media especially, were adamant about the ability of Ukrainian to use the drones and small FPV drones and things like that. Today, this is exactly the opposite. The Russians have discovered countermeasures to make the Ukrainian drones ineffective, and they have distributed the jamming technology down to the platoon level, and at the same time they have developed their own drone industry. I mean, both at tactical, operational, and strategic level, meaning that they were able to respond in the full spectrum of the kind of weapons that the West was providing, and this in a very short period of time. And in the same time, we have, from a more doctrinal point of view, the Ukrainian soldiers have complained several times that as they were trained in the West, especially in France, in the UK, and in Germany, that the Western officers didn't have any solid understanding of the type of war that was going on in Ukraine, because their own experience was based on what they had experienced in Afghanistan or in Iraq or somewhere else. As a result, the officers and the NCOs and soldiers that were trained in the West were not trained for the right war. And that's something that even Zelensky, by the way, complained about.
Right.
So the problem is that this war comes at the totally wrong time for the West, if you want, because after 30 years of wars against enemies that had a very poor technological environment, we are now facing the top-notch type of army, and our technology, and even the technology that we still have and we haven't given yet to Ukraine, even our technology is not up to the mark. Remember, in the last NATO summit, the US decided to deploy in Germany long-range missiles, including hypersonic missiles, but they don't even have them. I mean, they are still in development. So the Russians are using those hypersonic missiles since 1.5 years, not since the beginning of the war, because the very first strike that they done on Yariv in 2 weeks before, after the beginning of the operation, was a hypersonic missile. So the Russians have this technique or this technology which is operational. They have been able to improve it. They have been to better integrate it into the command and control system. They have been able to integrate it better into their doctrinal settings, while in the West, we don't even have them.
Right. And that actually illustrates what I think is the most important part of this show that we want to talk about here today. And that is what's going to happen next. Now, you have laid out very graphically many of the mistakes that the West has made, both in mentality and in physical capacity, really from the beginning of the war all the way through now. What is troubling, though, is what may be coming next. And if we continue on with this lack of understanding of what's happening and unfolding right in front of us, we could be in a real world of hurt, and especially Ukraine coming up shortly. Now, I played you a bit of a Viktor Orban earlier. I want to play one other section, a little short segment of that interview. One thing he said was really, really poignant as it relates to this article and what may be preparing to happen. Watch this first.
I'm speaking about energy which is invested into the front line. And I had a chance to have a conversation with the Ukrainian president and the Russian president, and believe me, that the forthcoming 2-3 months will be far more brutal than we think.
So he talked to Vladimir Putin and Zelensky, and especially the part about Putin, it sounds to me like he was told something, because he never said this about in the next 2 or 3 months and being more bloody until after he met with Putin. So his words indicate something is coming. His motivation to do this global effort to try to bring some peace implies that he knows something. Well, let's see what he might know. So going back to the RUSI article here, basically to have this attritional warfare, the country that's going to do it successfully has 2 phases, and I want to look at those here. So in an attritional warfare model, a successful strategy accepts that the war will last at least 2 years and be broken into 2 distinct phases. The first phase ranges from initiation of hostilities to the point to where sufficient combat power has been mobilized to allow for decisive action. It will see little positional shifting on the ground, focusing on favorable exchange of losses and building up combat power in the rear. Now, we've seen in recent days, actually the last month or so, more and more reports, even from the Ukrainian intelligence sources, claiming that there is somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Russian forces amassing in areas around just north of the border, on both in both in Russia and in Belarus. So it seems that they have done that. And certainly this 2-year frame, the Russians have been, as you've been describing throughout here, been preparing. Their industrial capacity is growing. Their arsenals have been growing. They've been training troops out of contact. Now then they have these at least 300,000 out of contact, and by some reports even more. So the question is, are they about to do something, and do you have any visibility on that?
First of all, we have to consider that the situation as it is today may have 3 fundamental outcomes. The first one is that you have kind of agreement and you have a settlement of the conflict, and this situation is probably something that we could have had in March 2022, for instance. The second is a defeat of Russia, and the third one is a defeat of Ukraine. Now, we know that the Western countries press Zelensky not to have any discussion. They are even punishing and sanctioning somehow Viktor Orban because of his initiative to go talk to Vladimir Putin. So the West is not keen to develop the possibility of negotiation and a kind of a settlement of the conflict. We know that at this stage, thinking about the defeat of Russia is excluded. So what remains is only a defeat of Ukraine. And this defeat, in my view, is of 2 nature. The first one, you can have an operational, if you want, defeat, in the sense that there is a point where Ukraine has no longer the means to sustain the war and therefore had to declare that they give up. That's one option. The other option is that, and that's probably what the Russians want to do, they develop this kind of attrition, and the attrition aims at depleting the capabilities and the capacities of the Ukrainians, both in terms of personnel and in terms of material equipment and armament and all that. At this stage, they may not be, let's say, satisfied of the level of attrition, and they may continue a little bit. Remember what Surovikin used to say: the aim of the attrition is to preserve our troops while degrading the forces of the enemy. And that's exactly what they are doing. So now they will continue to degrade the forces of Ukraine, And the more we provide weapons to Ukraine, in fact, is almost an incentive for the Russians to degrade even more the capabilities of Ukraine, meaning that basically the Russians are probably ready to do some operation, but they are waiting for the right moment of doing it. And this moment will be when they consider that the potential of Ukraine is depleted enough so that they can then launch an operation without having so much risk of being, let's say, some kind of failure, if you
And
want.
I want to show that the next part here. This is probably the most important part, because we want to talk about what might it look like. And I'm actually going to bring up here in a minute a map that's going to show where the current dispositions of forces are, and we'll kind of get your view on where something may go. But first of all, I want to describe what it would actually look like. This is the second phase. When the second phase begins, the offensive should be launched across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points using shallow attacks. The intent is to remain inside a layered bubble of friendly protective systems while stretching the depleted enemy reserves until the front collapses. Retreat then turns into rout. Only then should the offensive extend towards other objectives deeper in the enemy rear. The article goes on to discuss where he's talking about these protective bubbles, where it's like local anti-aircraft capabilities, etc. So a future offensive by the Russians would start on a broad front, find the weakest points, but then not launch in like some kind of Normandy type of breakout, but still go in relatively small chunks inside this bubble, going back until they get a break, and then they would roll large numbers of forces in there. That's the theory anyway. How do you see it physically playing out? What could Russia do?
Basically what the Russian, I mean, if you look at the doctrine, bluntly said, basically attacking on a broad front with a kind of superiority, maybe 2 or 3 to 1, and then have a breach into the line, the enemy line, by having in certain areas a superiority of 5 to 6 to 1. And that's what they may achieve. But again, I'm not sure if the situation at this stage is mature. You see, and if we look at the map again, I will come back to the map I showed accidentally before. If you look at the casualties that have been observed, or let's say announced by the Russian military Ministry of Defense in the last 2 months, you will see that if you have this kind of thermal imaging here, but the red shows where you have the most losses. I'm not guaranteeing that those figures are exact, because these are the official Russian figures. But regardless of whether they are precise or not, they show the intensity of the conflict, and probably where you have the most let's say the most intensive battles. And you see that the battle group north, which is here in the area of Kharkov, oh sorry, this is the French one. I don't know if I have the an English version. Sorry, I will try to look at yes, sorry, I have here an English version. Sorry. So the battle group north, which deals with the area of Kharkov, is not the most intense. You still have this intensity in the Donbass. Why is that more intense in the Donbass? Because the Russians have not yet pierced the defensive lines that were built since 2014 around the Donbass. And once they have pierced this defensive line, then we might, in my view, expect an attack on a broad front, and then have a real breakthrough type of operation. But that will be done once they have once for all eliminated the strongholds, the Ukrainian strongholds in the Donbass, because that's where you still have very heavy battles, and they don't want to have this kind of battle in their back. So this has to be solved before, and once they have solved that, in my view, that's my personal view. I'm not. The Russian general staff doesn't share his thoughts with me.
That's strange.
But
I want to, while you're talking about this, I want to show this map here. This is a current battle map, and it shows force dispositions. So you see that at least according to what's put in here, Russia doesn't have that many troops up in the north around the Sumy area here, the Kharkiv area, even though they've got these two relatively small scale operations, which seem more intent on drawing up Ukrainian reserves than actually causing a breakthrough. But this area right here is where you showed a lot of those casualties. Would you expect that if they eventually go on a push, it would be in one of these areas where it's higher density, or would they try to come in some of the other areas up here where there's lower Ukrainian density of troops?
I think they will, as they did in February, March 2022. They will do on both aspects. But the thing is that once they have breached the current Ukrainian defensive line around the Donbass, then there is nothing behind. This is open terrain, literally. What the fighting we are witnessing now in the Donbass area are still on those fortifications that were made by the Ukrainians in the last 10 years. So we once this is breached, this is open terrain, and for that reason I think the Russians have no need to rush. They will first have to breach these defensive line, and then they can operate. They will always do that with a main and a second or a third thrust. This is the way they do. My view is that they might have the main thrust still in the area of Donbass, because this is still there that you have the bulk of the Ukrainian forces, but we may have something else. What I think is that they will not, or they will try to avoid, let's say, to cross the Dnieper River, with the probable exception of Odessa. They might have here an operation around Odessa, but for the rest, I'm not sure they will strive to fight on the western side of the
Right. So let me ask you a question based on something you said earlier in this broadcast about the force ratios necessary for big cities. I've often heard many people say that Odessa would be a target for Russia, something that they would want to do for many strategic reasons, shut off the Black Sea, whatever, also because of its historic ties and some of the emotion that some Russians have on Odessa. But does Russia have enough troops to handle that? And would they have an actual assault on the city, or would they just try to isolate it and have a siege mentality?
Probably not a siege, but they will probably attack. Well, one aspect that we haven't discussed, which is quite important, but never mentioned in the media, is that on the western part of Ukraine, you have a resistance. You have a resistance movement that operates on the rear area of the Ukrainians. And in fact, most of the missile strikes that we have on attachments depot and ammunition depots or factories for FPV drones and things like that, all the intelligence comes from the resistance movement, and these resistance movements are extremely active. You have many of them. The probably most famous of them is the Russian Kherson. Russian Kherson is the one that operates in the south of the country up to Odessa. They assassinate political leaders, SBU members, and things like that. So it's very active, extremely active. It doesn't reflect in our media for obvious reasons, but that's probably something the Russians are building up, because I suspect that you have also those Russian special forces, the so-called Spetsnaz, who are involved in the rear area of the Ukrainians to build up those resistance forces in order to support a possible offensive at a later stage. And that's probably something we have to take into account, especially if there is an operation in Odessa. Remember that Odessa, you have a lot of Russian-speaking people who are fed up with the Ukrainian rule, and they may then take arms against the Russian army. And we may have a situation very similar to the one we had in Crimea in 2014, where in fact the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian troops deployed in Crimea, in fact, defected to the Russians, and that's a situation that we may have. I don't know if the Russians count or something like that. So we may have a combined type of operation with amphibious operation plus action of the resistance, and an operation through the Dnieper by some amphibious task force or something like that.
But
So
your argument is that that wouldn't even, I guess, begin until there had been some sort of penetration in the front lines along those areas you showed in your map, right?
that's correct. That's correct. That's what I think.
So let me ask you this: what do you think is the? I mean, just your best assessment, given the limitations you have on knowing a lot of the factors on the ground on both sides of the line of contact. How much longer can Ukraine hold out in current circumstances?
Well, that's a good question, because at the end of the day, it comes back to the acceptance of the population and the military to accept the situation. And we see that the resilience of the armed forces is reducing every day. You have more and more. I think just in the first 6 months of this year, you had as many deserters as the whole last year. So, meaning that they have already arrested or identified, let's say, something like 25,000 deserters of the Ukrainian forces. You have more and more units who are refusing to obey orders. Um, Even elite forces, by the way, that are refusing to obey orders. You have this constant reshuffle, and Zelensky just made some change at the head of the high command of the Ukrainian forces, meaning that we see that the whole system starts to crumble a little bit. And a lot will depend on that, I think, because on the political side, you have the same thing. I mean, you have obviously a more and more importance of the ultranationalists and all that. They try to get control over the political life, but this has a drawback, because people are noticing that the nature of the political leadership changes, and it becomes more and more dictatorial, if you want.
Yeah.
And and that may affect also the way people will understand. And you see, there are 40%. I mean, there was recently a poll made in Ukraine that shows that 40% of the Ukrainians are in favor of a settlement with Russia, and they are even ready to give up territories. So we see that things are changing very rapidly within the Ukrainian society. Um, what you just in the excerpt you showed of the RUSI article, or Vershinin article, that the impact of the war on the economy. You mentioned that about Russia, you mentioned that about the West, but it affects also Ukraine, because now all these guys you are taking from the street and putting with just a very basic training, you put them on the battlefield. These guys are not available for the economy. And we
right.
see that the economy is also crumbling. I mean, there are no discussions with the World Bank to avoid Ukraine being in default. So, meaning that we are focusing, obviously, because you and me are colonels, so we focus on the military side, which is very fine. But in reality,
Yeah,
a war must be sustained by an
economic,
economy, and
right.
this economy is crumbling as well. So you have a multiplication effect of the crumbling of the economy on the war and the war potential, if you want. And if you add to this the fatigue of the West, if you add to this the fact that
Yeah,
if people are in the West, especially in the US, by the way, people are anticipating the election of
right.
Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who incidentally both of them have this idea that there is no point funding a war
It
that
can't be
is a
won.
black
Yeah,
hole in
right.
essence. So people are anticipating that, and they know, and that's also, you feel that in all the remarks, the recent remarks of Zelensky, who, by the way, is ready now to engage discussions with the Russians, what he refused to do
Yeah,
even before the
NATO summit.
summit in
Yeah.
Switzerland. But now he seems to accept that. He has said that several times and repeated that a couple of days ago. So and
Yeah,
the
we'll see if they actually follow through with that, or what his intent is. I suspect that he's probably saying, "Yeah, I'll talk to you and here are my terms." Don't think it's
no,
going to
that
work out that way.
No, that's true. That's true. But at the same time, there must be some kind of realpolitik. I mean, the policy of reality that comes slowly to the surface, because obviously everybody can see that there are some limitation to the wishful thinking. There is a point where the reality starts to collide with your intent and your visions,
And
and
break
that's
through it.
exactly what we're
Yeah,
witnessing.
and so let me ask you that as we close up here. Let's just, for the sake of argument here, assume that at some point there is going to be some kind of either collapse in the Ukrainian defensive systems, or that Zelensky somehow actually does engage in negotiations that will definitely not be in their favor and probably won't be as good as the one that Putin offered on the 6th of July this year, or 6th of June rather this year. Probably it's going to continue to be worse the longer it goes. But what do you think is going to happen to the Western way of war, the Western mentality, when that inevitable day breaks through all the spin and imposes itself on us in reality? How are we going to deal with that at the leader level when all these countries, U.S., Britain, Germany, and France especially, have been just nonstop talking about victory and success, and all of a sudden one day it just crumbles in their hands? How are they going to respond to that?
I think from the U.S. perspective, it will be the easiest because basically Donald Trump can say, "Well, that's not my war. I can end it," as he did with Afghanistan, by the way. Because remember, that was also Trump who negotiated the settlement with the Taliban. The problem is that Biden didn't comply with the agreement, and that's the reason why the withdrawal from Afghanistan became a catastrophe, a disaster. But that's because Biden didn't want to implement the agreement as it had been signed by the Donald Trump team and the Taliban. In any case, the Trump had no problem to stop the war in Afghanistan because he didn't start it. He didn't start it. So for him, it was no problem to stop it. On the contrary, and that will be exactly the same thing with Ukraine. And I think I cannot speak for all the Americans, but the few Americans, a friend I have, but well, all of them start to be a little bit fed up with this conflict that brings nothing. It's open ended. It brings absolutely no objective is achieved. As a result, people don't want it, and they
And
don't
and
want it
and what
anymore.
about France and the UK? Because
Well,
they
that's the big problem because they are still in office, and they made everything possible so that this conflict happened. So that will be psychologically difficult for them. But if the US doesn't want to continue with that conflict, and that's probably the reason why the US suggested the pivot, which is basically not new. It was initiated by Obama during his mandate. There has this pivot toward Asia and China. So if the US say that, the European will have to comply because they don't have the resources
Yeah.
to supplement what the US is doing. And that's why they are afraid, by the way, because they have absolutely no capabilities to replace the US assistance. So as a result, they will be constrained to accept the conditions that will be defined by probably Donald Trump, or if this happened after his election, or let's say in the coming months, and what the Americans decide. So that certainly, but that will still be a problem within the European Union, because the European Union is extremely fanatical. And you see that Viktor Orban, for instance, they even tried to sanction him and
Yeah.
to make some punishment and to restrict his ability to make a decision within the European Union system. So we see that in Europe that will be probably the most difficult part, because you have a bunch of fanatical individuals who want war, and they have always been like this. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at what happened in the Balkan War, remember all these attacks against Serbia and all that. All the government at that time in Europe were all leftist government. They
Yeah.
were all
Well,
socialist. Okay. So
yeah.
we have the same pattern today, and that's where we may have difficulty within Europe. But at the
And
end of the day,
and I tell you what, I think that especially if things go the way they're trending right now, Orban's going to come out looking really good at this, whereas some of these other leaders are going to be trashed. I think in a historical context, but who knows? I mean, we'll see how all this plays out. None of these things have happened yet. We just see a lot of the trends, and that's why we're so grateful to have you on today to really talk through a lot of this stuff and kind of explain how it's working out. We really thank you for coming on today, Colonel.
that was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And I always appreciate you guys being with us. Ask you to come back and join us at 3:00 because we have another really, really important episode to talk about today. Is the U.S. and Germany provoking Putin in ways that could possibly end up in a nuclear war? There are some developments that not many people have been paying a lot of attention to with the deployment of some U.S. Missiles. And Ted Postal, the MIT professor, has come and tell us today exactly what's going on with that and why we should be worried and what we should do instead. Tune in at 3:00 today on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and we will see you on the next episode.